Welcome to the Superintendent's Hangout, where we discuss topics in education, charter schools, life in general, and not necessarily in that order. I'm your host, Dr. Sharetta. Come on in and hang out. In episode 8, I sat down for a hangout with Richard Barrera. Richard was first elected to represent District D on the San Diego Unified School Board in 2008, and then was reelected by overwhelming margins in 2012, 16, and 2020. Richard's focus continues to be on achieving equity and excellence for all students in San Diego. That includes both traditional district schools as well as charter schools, as you'll hear in this interview. He has spearheaded the district's efforts to keep class sizes low, integrate the arts into traditional academic instruction, make UC A through G courses and ethnic studies available to all students, supported strong bilingual education for all students, and much, much more. Over the past 2 years, Richard has also led the district's effort to create community schools and to expand transitional kindergarten to all 4-year-olds. Richard has led the district's efforts in securing over $8 billion for school facilities with successful voter-approved bond campaigns in 2008, 2012, and 2018. You'll hear us chat about this in the episode. Richard is a first-generation San Diegan whose father immigrated to the United States from Colombia and whose grandparents immigrated through Ellis Island. Richard also talks about this in the episode. He has spent nearly 3 decades striving to improve the lives of working families in San Diego and throughout the United States. Richard lives in San Diego and currently serves on the board of the Center on Policy Initiatives and the California Immigration Policy Center, and is active with the Cesar Chavez Service Clubs. He is a graduate of El Cajon Valley High School, holds a bachelor's degree in history from University of California, San Diego, and a master's degree in public policy from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And he describes some of that experience in the episode. In 2022, Barrera was named School Board Member of the Year by the San Diego County School Boards Association. It was an honor and a pleasure to sit down and hang out with Richard, and I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Thank you for joining us, Richard. Thanks for coming to the Superintendent's Hangout and spending a little time with us today.
No, great to be here, David. Beautiful, beautiful hangout you've got here, by the way.
Thank you. In the future, they're pushing me to have a YouTube component to this too, but I'm not sure that I want to have to worry about how I look while I'm talking. But right. We'll see. We'll see how that goes. But the studio's coming along. Our staff made it great for us. So, so thank you again. And I was wondering if you could start off by just sharing with our listeners your origin story, where you come from, what brings you to the moment, and also something of interest about you or something that you enjoy doing or that is not included in your official bio. We're going to link your bio in the show notes, and it's very impressive and extensive, but something personal.
No, great. No, it sounds great. So I was born in L.A., but our family moved to San Diego when I was 2, and so I grew up in El Cajon. And my dad was an immigrant from Colombia, and my mom, her parents were immigrants who came through Ellis Island, from Ireland and Germany and Scandinavia, the whole thing. So, and so we ended up in El Cajon, which is, was an interesting place, to grow up as an immigrant kid. Although El Cajon High, where I went in the early 80s, had huge influxes of immigrant kids at the time who were coming from Vietnam or the Middle East or, Latin America. So it was very much, a very diverse, place to grow up, but a lot of tension as well, in a place like the East County. So, yeah, I grew up in El Cajon. I graduated from UCSD, went to graduate school on the East Coast at the Kennedy School, and then spent about 6 years outside of San Diego. So I became a community organizer. And that's something that I didn't know what that was, at the time. Certainly I was in college or graduate school, but the idea appealed to me because it was the basic notion that people, especially people who are getting the short end of the stick, they can actually be the answer, to issues, and they don't have to wait around, for a politician or, somebody else to solve their problems. They can actually come together, create a vision as a community, and then move things forward. And so that resonated with me as, a way to make, social change and achieve social justice. And so that's what I did for, about a decade. And I organized in places like Little Rock, Arkansas, which was an amazing experience because I had never, been in the South before I moved there. Chicago, the South side of Chicago, different places around the country. And then as part of the work I was doing as a community organizer, I met a couple of people here in San Diego who had organized the Domestic Workers Union. And it was the second union that Cesar Chavez had inspired. And it was a couple of former black nationalists, Ken Msemaji and Fahadi Jeffers. And they themselves had started as community organizers. They didn't have a background in labor. But when you're organizing people who, home care providers who work in people's homes, there's no common workplace. But people tend to live in the same neighborhoods, so the kind of the concept of community organizing was something that we could apply in helping organize a union of domestic workers. And that's what got me into the labor movement. And I then spent over a decade, working in organized labor. So, yeah.
It's quite a journey, a lot of geographical variety too,
yes,
right?
Yes.
El Cajon to La Jolla to Boston,
yeah,
right? And then Little
Rock, Chicago, and then we had projects in Atlanta and Pittsburgh and different cities. So, yeah, it was a great way of, getting to know the country as a young person. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I think I recall that one of our recent presidents got his start as a community organizer, right?
That's exactly right.
And when I read that in the bio, I thought, I'm not totally sure that I know exactly what that is.
Yeah. It's basically a job where, and it's, similar to, I think if you think about a good teacher in a classroom or a good, school leader, it's the person that listens to people, helps them develop their own, vision, and then helps guide them, to make progress towards that vision. So I think in a lot of ways, it's, the skills of an organizer are similar to the skills of an educator. So I think it's something that you, David, I think you yourself are an organizer. It's just the way of, it's a way of helping people make change.
How much of your studies at Harvard helped with that? Because it was, you said
public policy,
an MPA or
MPP,
MPP.
Yeah. Well, so in some ways, it was my frustration, there that helped guide me towards being an organizer. Because, to be honest, so when I was at the Kennedy School in the late '80s, there was very much a kind of a bias towards the way you solve, big problems in society is through technical solutions. So if you're just really, really smart and you can come up with the right solution on paper, everybody should listen to you and everything should work out. And And for me, that just never resonated. It's sort of taking the people out of public policy. And it's not that, there's not a, place for good policy analysis and good policy solutions. There always is. But we're in a democracy. And so if we're going to move forward on making real change, that change has to be driven by people who themselves have to have a role in creating that policy. And so when I was at the Kennedy School, I met some people who had been involved in community organizing in different places around the country. And the concept was something that was new to me, but it was, again, something that felt right. Let's get people at the forefront of setting the agenda, and then we can bring in, kind of the policy experts. But let's understand where the force for change really should come from.
Yeah, that's interesting that we often, and then if you don't have that human side,
Yes.
then sometimes people will vote at times against their best interests.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We've seen in some recent presidential elections. That's me editorializing.
I'm with
so
you. Yeah.
I guess the perfect situation is when the human side matches the policy
That's
side,
right.
and you can sync those up.
That's right.
So where do you jump from? Maybe it's not a huge jump, but move from the community organizing aspect into your service as a school board member, as a trustee for San Diego Unified, which is the fifth or sixth largest district in the country? Or
We're second largest in California.
Yeah.
I think we're top 20.
Top 20.
I don't know exactly where we fall.
It's big.
We're a big district.
Big urban district.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's interesting because the work I did as a community organizer and as a labor organizer was usually around at the community level issues like developing more affordable housing, developing jobs, that were accessible, to people in the community. As a union organizer, was improving, wages and working conditions of, often people like home care workers or nursing assistants and custodians, janitors in hospitals, low-wage workers. But the reason that people were putting so much of their own time and effort into making change was not that they expected that there was going to be huge change in their own lifetimes. Mm-hmm. It was to make a better life for their kids. Often, immigrant communities, immigrant workers, I worked with. And so, even though the issues were often not directly connected to schools were always the most important issue in every community I ever worked with. In some cases, the school was the center of community, and we would run job training programs or hold community forums, in the neighborhood school. So I always knew the power of what public schools means, to the communities that I was working in. And by the way, for my own family, for my parents, who came. My dad came to this country, my mom's parents, first in their families to go to college. Public school meant everything. Mm-hmm. That was the opportunity for their kids, to be able to, become contributors, in this society. So I've always known, that public schools are really the most important institution, to families who are trying to strive, for better, for future generations. What was hard for me in running for office for the first time was the idea of being out front. So an organizer, a community organizer, also, a labor organizer, your job is to develop leadership in other people and to kind of be the person at the back of the room.
You're kind of the shepherd.
You're the shepherd. That's exactly right. And so the idea of kind of being, out in the front of the room was not something that I was comfortable with, and I wasn't convinced, was the right thing to do. But what some of the people who had mentored me and, had a lot of experience working both with elected officials and working in the community, what they talked about was, well, it's up to you what kind of elected official you want to be. If you want to be the person that's out there, making speeches and, kind of being obsessed with your own power,
right,
you can do that. That makes you like every other elected official.
Politics as a career.
Politics as a career, right. But if you want to use elected office as a platform to organize from, it can be a very powerful platform, because if what you're basically saying to communities that you're working with, look, if you do the hard work of developing a vision, developing an agenda, moving that vision forward, but you've got an ally in office who can help put something on an official agenda, take a vote that's going to actually result in change, that can be a powerful ally to communities, because it can move things forward and can create momentum. And so that notion of using elected office as an opportunity to more powerfully help organize people, that was appealing. And so that's, when I ran for office, it was, kind of with that in mind. And by the way, if you read what Barack Obama talks about, his own transformation from an organizer to the first time he ran for office as an elected official, a similar process. Getting your head around, moving from the back of the room, but still using the position of elected office as a way to help communities organize.
So what year did you run? What was your first year when you were elected to this?
2008.
2008.
Yes.
So you've seen quite an arc.
Seen a lot.
You've seen a lot
in this district,
on the board.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads into the next question of, what do you think is your greatest, not you, perhaps either individually or a board that you were working with at the time, what is your greatest success as a trustee, something you're most proud of, and then also what has been the greatest challenge that you faced?
And I think they're kind of the same, cut from the same cloth. So what I'm most proud of is that the dominant conversation in our district today is very different from what it was, 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, I would characterize the dominant conversation as we need to focus on schools as if they're a business, as if they're a big business. And the product is test scores. And so what we're going to do is we're going to reduce everything that, goes into the education of a young person into these once a year, at the time, Scantron, fill in the bubble, answers, around literacy and math.
Being careful that there are not too many excessive erasures, right? Because then it gets thrown out.
That gets thrown out, right? But I think the reason for that was, it's almost like, well, we want to have things that are easy to measure, because that's the way that, we can sort of somehow hold, a system accountable. And so we're going to reduce education to something that we can easily measure. And that's not the way that an educator in a classroom thinks of, the growth of their own kids. But as a system, that's the way we're going to somehow, evaluate whether we're a good system or a bad system. And I think that was the dominant conversation 15 years ago. And I think that was coupled with, especially in California, a conversation that was, schools need to make do with the resources that they have, and very much a kind of an austerity conversation. And it's so, it's, if schools are underfunded, that's reality. And so then what you have to do is you got to think about all the things you should throw away in a school system so you can drill down and focus on, growth in once a year test scores. And that was certainly, So in running for school board, the, first question, that I would be asked, the candidates would be asked is, what are you going to do to increase test scores? And what are you going to do to get a hold of budget challenges, given, that you gotta work in a sort of an austere environment. And I think today in our district, the conversation has really not only changed, but has gone back to asking educators, asking parents, asking kids, what's most important to you? What do you value from a public education system? And of course, when you start to have that conversation, what you'll quickly get to a consensus around is we want kids to have confidence in themselves as learners. So we want them to understand what it is that they're learning. We want them to actually help shape what's important to them as learners. But it's an understanding that where society is going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it's so arrogant for adults to assume that we're going to know what kids are going to grow up with. If you look back 10, 20 years, we never would have predicted, the things that kids are needing to, to be able to handle today. So all we can really do as an education system is to light kids on fire and help develop that love of learning and that confidence in learning. And that can't be measured, through, a standardized, test that you're taking once a year. It's not about reducing the outcomes that we hold ourselves accountable to. It's expanding, what those outcomes can look like. And I think that's very much, where the conversation has come in our district. And so if that means, big investments in arts and music education, big investments in approaches like ethnic studies, career pathways. It's a very different, I think, conversation about what we expect out of our public schools today than what we had, than the conversation that was going on 15 years ago. And again, I think it's, similar to, what we talked about with sort of the, public policy geniuses at the Kennedy School. It's not a conversation that's driven by experts from on high. It's a conversation that's driven by who's in that classroom, who's closest to our kids, including students themselves. That, I think, has been, the biggest transformation that, we've seen over 15 years. The biggest challenge is the challenge that, we continue to face, which is our public schools are not resourced to provide kids what they need. And, certainly as, if anything, what the pandemic did was clarify how important student social emotional learning is, how important mental health needs are, of our students, and how important that relationship is between an educator and students, which doesn't happen if you've got, overcrowded classrooms and everybody in that classroom, students and educators alike, are overstressed. But it continues to be our reality, and it continues to be our reality because even though what the pandemic produced, we were fortunate that especially the federal government responded to the pandemic, with an influx of resources, the likes of which we'd never seen before. Those resources are going to go away in a couple of years. And it shouldn't have taken a pandemic to create the kind of investment in public schools that our kids have always needed. And those needs are not going to go away in a couple of years, if those federal resources are not replaced. And we're going to be back to, the same, conversation that we've always had, which is year after year after year. How do we, make a public school system work that we know does not have the resources that are effective in supporting kids and lighting kids on fire and believing in themselves as learners.
How did we get to where we are? I mean, why are we not in Massachusetts or New York?
Well, I think there's a very clear answer to that, and that is political agendas. So when California passed Proposition 13 in the late 70s, almost overnight, we went from being one of the top states in terms of investment in public education, and not just our K-12 system, but our community colleges,
K-16,
Cal State,
yeah,
K-16, UC system. We were in a lot of ways the envy of the world in terms of our investment in public education, and almost overnight, we went from being at the top to being at the very bottom. And what happened along the way was not only the one change in Prop 13, which was kind of changing the tax structure in a way that took investment out of public schools, but since then there have been people who've been very smart or very clever about kind of manipulating the rules in California to make it very, very difficult for the public to actually invest in public education in a way that we would want. Most efforts to, for instance, increase revenue to bring money into the public schools requires a 2/3 vote, whether it's at the local level or whether it's at the state level. And, very few states have these kind of supermajority rules. So, the governor didn't get elected with 2/3 of the vote. The president, doesn't get elected with 2/3 of the vote. The mayor didn't get 2/3 of the vote. But it requires 2/3 of people in a very polarized, political atmosphere to agree on increasing revenue in order to invest in public schools. 60% might agree, 62% might agree, but that's not good enough. And because of those rules, we continue to be in a situation where I don't think it's the will of Californians to be at rock bottom in investing in public education. But the reality is we're there because it's so hard, to make change and to increase revenue. And so I think it's important for us as, public education advocates to really understand why we've got a set of rules that are fundamentally undemocratic and work against the interests of the majority of Californians. And there's a lot of that fundamental stuff that's, written into whether it's the California Constitution or, different local and state laws that needs to be undone if we're going to make progress in investment in public schools.
It's interesting. No matter left or right, no one wants to touch the third rail of property tax, the property tax debate, right?
Yeah.
And I think it was Warren Buffett was talking about the fact that he obviously doesn't have to worry about the details of property tax, but that his house in Omaha, he was paying more in property taxes on his house in Omaha than his house in Malibu.
Yes.
Both of which he'd bought 1,000,000 years ago.
Yeah, and you think about the property tax structure again, which is protected, by these kind of supermajority rules. Disneyland, which was kind of assessed at the time of the passage of Prop 13, is still essentially paying the property taxes that it did in the late 70s. But if you go and buy a house today, your property tax are going to be much higher, than Disneyland. So there's all those issues. What I would say is, as evidence of how when you change these rules, you see a better result, school bond measures used to require a 2/3 majority. In the early 2000s, there was a state amendment, a state initiative that lowered that threshold to 55%. Still not 50%, which is what most elections are decided upon, but went from you got to get 2/3, passage to 55%. The result has been hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in, local school facilities, including here, here at Einstein. We now have the largest public works program in the history of the city with our school bond programs. So we've passed 4 bond measures since 2008, $11.5 billion that voters have stepped up and said, we are willing to actually increase our property taxes to invest in public schools. None of those measures would have passed a 2/3 threshold.
Right.
They all have passed generally around 62, 65%, which you would consider an overwhelming majority. But in the old days, in the old rules, that wouldn't have been good enough, because that threshold, that simple act of lowering a threshold from 2/3 to 55%, has meant a real transformation, in the future of our public schools here in San Diego and a lot of the states. So something as simple as that, if we just had a democratic threshold so that voters could decide for themselves, I'm willing to make some sacrifice to bring in some revenue for schools, I think we would see dramatic transformation pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'm going to return to that school bond topic in a minute, especially as it applies both to traditional district schools and also charters.
Yeah.
I know there's some discussion about some draft legislation that might change the way that schools are funded instead of an average daily attendance to just an enrollment.
Yeah.
And I know, again, thinking about structural changes that can kind of work within the system to shift things. I know there are states where their schools are funded on enrollment. You enroll 1,000 kids, this is what you get your funding for.
Yes.
And we've got this, I would say, a system that favors communities where the structures are set up so that students just inherently attend school more consistently.
Absolutely. No, you're exactly. I think we're one of 7 states in the country that has an enrollment versus, an average daily attendance versus an enrollment formula. And again, it's the same kind of political interests that drove Prop 13 that have, written supermajority requirements, into municipal and state laws that have created this, again, what's in some ways a very punitive system. And why is it important that schools should be funded based on enrollment versus attendance? Well, it's pretty simple. If a kid doesn't come to school that day, the school, if it's a charter school, or the school district can't simply cut spending, by 1/25 or whatever that is, for that day. The teacher's still going to be there. The staff's going to be there. The facilities are going to be there. And, it's, but this notion that we should be penalized when a kid misses a day of school, even though the expenses have to be there, to support full classrooms, that's, again, baked into, what I think is this concept of austerity around public schools. The current conversation about moving to an enrollment-based funding system, which I absolutely support, but we've got to also understand that if we move to an enrollment-based funding system, which the estimate is that would result in about $3 billion of additional revenue for public schools, we also have to expand the total pie of funding for education, because if we stay at our current sort of cap, which is essentially 40% of money for the state general, fund goes to public schools. But now there's an additional $3 billion. What's going to happen is that's going to come out of someplace else, and we're going to be robbing Peter to pay Paul. And so we should be funding schools based on enrollment rather than attendance. But in order to do that, there's got to be an overall increase in the pie for public schools of, $3 billion or whatever that number turns out to be.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where that discussion goes.
Yeah.
Even though we're a state with, you might argue, the forces that certainly where the power lies now in Sacramento is not the same as it was when Prop 13 passed. we're still stuck in some ways, right? With some arcane structures.
The structures are what keep us stuck. And so, for instance, if the legislature and the governor wanted to even bring an initiative to voters to say, would you be willing to lower the threshold for operating revenue measures, from 2/3 to 55% in the way that we did for facilities measures, it would require 2/3 of the legislature to vote to put it on the ballot. And you've got, legislative districts, which, if somebody steps up and, and does the right thing for schools, there's likely to be a, backlash, against that person. And so, yeah, it's something that we need to get ourselves out of. I actually think it is possible, to get ourselves out of this. But the first thing is we have to understand it, and we've got to understand that it's not that Californians are unwilling to raise revenue for schools. In fact, every time we ask Californians, are you willing to do it? They say yes. If you think about Prop 30, back in 2012, Prop 55, our local, school bond measures, voters very consistently say yes to revenue to support public schools. But to require that 2/3 of voters, meet that threshold is what gets in our way.
Returning to the facilities bond conversation, which is a fascinating one, and has been transformative for Albert Einstein Academies and many other charter schools in San Diego and also district sites.
Yeah.
We've had, and I'm probably going to miss a few letters, but we've had going back, 15 or more years. We've had Proposition MM. We had S. We had Z, YY, U.
Yes, that's right.
And so the last three charter schools have, I think perhaps in the first time in the country that this has happened, that charter schools have been able to participate at a pro rata share to really be able to use those funds to transform facilities for students.
Yes.
What was that discussion like? How did that transition happen, and why is it not happening in other places?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty fundamental principle, which is charter schools are public schools, and when people in a community go to vote to support their public schools, they're voting to support all of their public schools. And, so there should not be a distinction between if a student attends a school run by a district or a school, that's a charter school, which, by the way, most voters don't know what a charter school versus a district school even is. What they're saying is we're supporting our kids. Right. And so it was important to me. It was important to leaders in the district and in the charter community and all of these bond measures to say, look, let's make sure that this is an investment that benefits all public school students in our district, because the taxpayers are supporting or are intending to support all of our public schools. And I think that I think it's very short-sighted when we see some other districts. We've got districts here in San Diego County where charter schools are operating out of aging facilities that are inadequate, and the voters have passed bond measures, but the district is saying, yeah, but that money doesn't go to charter schools. By the way, often those charter schools are actually operating out of district-owned facilities. And so the district is failing to invest in its own property. Right. But even more important than that, it's not investing in all kids. I don't think that's the right approach. And I think being clear that we are one public education ecosystem here in San Diego, and that district schools and charter schools in the ideal, world are supporting each other, learning from each other. If we're helping educate kids in a district school or a charter school, that's going to go to the benefit of all schools in our district. I think because we've been able to have that conversation, and a lot of it, I think, is based on relationships between charter leaders, school district leaders. I think that has allowed us to avoid some of the divisiveness, that we see in other places around the state where there's a big fight, between district schools and charter schools. I think, there's always a balance, and, I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit about, how do we have a system that is working in the interest of all students. But the basic idea that we need to support all students in our public schools, I think that has been fairly unique in San Diego as compared, certainly to some other large urban areas around California. And I think it's allowed us to get some things done and make progress for all kids rather than getting, dragged down into that fight.
Yeah, it's something that I'm personally very thankful for, because I think long after we're in our hammocks somewhere, there'll be generations of students who are learning in facilities that are worthy of the students.
Yes.
I think if we can stick to that standard,
That's
then
right.
There shouldn't be district versus charter, left versus right.
That's right. That's right.
I think back to when I started teaching in 94 at a charter school, and people didn't really. I didn't even really understand the difference between a charter and a traditional district school.
Yes.
I didn't have a teaching credential in those days. You didn't need one.
Yes.
A lot's changed in 29 years.
Yes.
You joined the board in 08.
Yes.
So the charter school law passed in 92.
Yes.
So it had been around.
Yes.
So you got to, but you still caught a lot of that, some growth spurts in charters within San Diego Unified.
Yeah.
Could you talk to us about your experience of participating in that and watching that from the trustee side? Because, as a charter leader, we're often in echo chambers of our own comments about district authorizers and that inherent tension between your authorizer and the charter, where we're essentially, if you want to boil it down to market forces, we're essentially competing for the same students.
Yeah.
But you have an entity that is the authorizing entity and has some authority over the school.
Yeah.
What has your experience been, and has any of your thinking shifted over the years?
Yeah, well, the community has evolved, pretty considerably in the last 15 years. So when I came onto the board, I think we were in a period that you almost, kind of think of as like a startup period and a startup environment. And charter schools were coming forward, in large numbers. New petitions to start new schools, were coming forward pretty fast. And I think over maybe the first 5 or 6 years, that I was on the board, we saw the percentage of total students in the district who were attending charter schools go from maybe about 8 or 9% up to 15, 16%. So there was a pretty rapid period of growth of new charter schools. And on the one hand, I think that allowed for some great innovation. It allowed for the creation of some models, in our district that, that are exciting and that have fulfilled part of what the intention was of the initial charter law, which was to create laboratories of learning that could then be picked up, by the district system. And I think we've certainly seen that happen in a lot of cases in San Diego. I think the challenge became that how do you preserve some stability for not just existing district schools, but existing charter schools, in a community if you constantly have new petitions coming forward. And I think that has been the kind of the change in perspective, not just of our local board, but I think that has led, to some of the legislation that we've seen in the past few years at the state level. So as a school board trustee, it's my job to think about the interests of all students. It's not my job to think about, I govern the district-run schools. And so, like you say, what you're saying is obviously very real, David, that I think there is a perspective often, among school districts that we're competing with the charters for the same group of kids. Well, our job is to think, what's in the interest of all of the students in our community? And if there's an opportunity to create a new, exciting program for kids that doesn't exist, in the community, and that creates an option for kids and parents, I think, what we should always say is that's going to add to our ecosystem. That's going to add value to the overall, strength of public schools in the community. However, if people are coming forward to form a new charter school that really is not any different from what already exists, and the impact of a new school starting up is really just going to be, you're going to drain students from existing district schools or charter schools. Well, that's not good for all kids in the community. It might be that people who want to run a charter school, that's in their interest, but that's not in the overall interests of students in the community. And so I think we definitely hit a point in San Diego where we had to, take a step back and say, we've got actually a very strong existing ecosystem. Today, I don't know what the number is, but I think we're between 45 and 50 charter schools. We're about 200 district schools. We've got, in any community in this city, you're going to find great options, for parents, whether it's their neighborhood school or whether it's a school that specializes in a certain program. So I think we've got a very robust, choice environment for parents in San Diego. But I think it's now our responsibility to make sure that ecosystem has the stability it needs to succeed. And so I think we're not in that startup environment anymore. I think we're in a let's make the system work, as it exists. And frankly, and this is, I know, something that some folks in the charter community, were not necessarily on the same page as I was in the recent legislation, AB 1505 in particular. But as a trustee, again, with responsibility to think of the interests of all students and families in the community, I think there is an interest in stability. And now having some authority as a trustee to say, I know you want to start a school, but how is that school different from what we already have? And are you going to undermine, what we already have in our existing schools if you start up a new school? I think having the authority as a trustee to ask those questions and make decisions based on that level of analysis, which didn't exist, prior to 1505, I think is an important step forward.
Yeah, it's interesting when you mention the relationships piece.
Yeah,
and that I think has existed really well in San Diego, at least, and this is just my own personal take on it. But in my time in San Diego, the relationship between charters that I've been involved with and the district has been excellent.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's not a unilateral experience, but that's me.
Yeah.
And when we think about, when I interviewed Eric Premack from CSDC in a previous episode, and he talks about, getting a law passed is just the first step.
That's right.
And it's not the hardest step. The hardest step
That's
is
right.
implementation.
Yes.
And so lawmakers do what they're going to do.
Yeah.
But then how does the rubber meet the road?
Yeah.
And it's going to look different everywhere.
That's right.
And so that's, I think, where the relationship piece comes in, and where the setting clear expectations
That's right.
comes in, and are we going to go by the absolute letter of the law? And that's probably a misleading term anyway, because what is the
What
letter?
is the law? Yeah.
Impact in a community
Yes.
is
Can be a pretty fuzzy,
it's a pretty fuzzy
thing.
Concept, it depends
yeah.
on who is holding the microphone at that time.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a new era for charters. Certainly, we're now 30 plus years old.
Yes.
It's not a movement anymore.
Yes.
People call it a sector. As you say, it's 20 to 25% of the enrollment within San Diego Unified attends charters.
Yes.
And oftentimes I think we'll see families where one student is in a charter
That's
school
right.
and the other one is in a traditional district school.
Yes.
So interesting. And I actually think, if I'm not mistaken, that the school that I first started at, Miss Shivani, does that ring a bell? Didn't Miss Shivani have one of your children as a student for a while?
At San Diego Cooperative?
No, Harriet Tubman. Did you?
At Harriet Tubman?
Yeah,
that's exactly right. Yes.
So I started teaching with Miss Shivani. So that was before you were a trustee.
That was before I was a trustee. It was when my older son was in first and second grade.
And I had all my hair. and all my hair and even less common sense than I have now. I was 24 years old. So it's interesting how this has evolved, right? I can say that, and this is probably going to get me in trouble with my charter school colleagues somewhat, but that wouldn't be the first time. But I can say that the Wild West feeling of the first 5 to 8 or more years of charters could be really unsettling.
Yes.
People had no idea what a charter school did.
Yes.
I remember the first time the state test, I want to say they were called STAR tests back in those days. The packets arrived, and I remember a principal who, I'm not even going to say what gender they were because then people are going to try to figure out which principal it was, but principal saying, you know what, it's okay. I'm just going to keep him in my office. We don't focus on that. We focus on these other things here.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking it was just, people kind of doing what they wanted to do.
Yes.
Not in every charter.
Yes.
There are legacy charters that have been around, and this is not to throw mud at Harriet Tubman School because they've been around now for almost 30 years, right?
And a lot of change.
Right? Changes in leadership, changes in student population, changes in size. They've also benefited from the facilities bonds tremendously, a new athletic field, and so all really good things. But I remember when the rules changed and chartered employees had to get their credentials.
Yes.
And there was this whole uproar, like, oh, I can't believe it. So it's interesting how the sector has evolved over this time.
I mean, I think some of these concepts, kind of startup environment, competition, again, frankly, I think they come from the same mentality. I refer to it as a sort of a corporate reform, notion of what's best for public education. That is not the right concept for public schools. So a startup environment means, by definition, you're going to have some schools that succeed and a lot of schools that don't. And do we want a public school system that you have that constant experimentation? And by definition, the schools that aren't succeeding means how many years of a kid's academic career are being lost, to a school that doesn't really, have its act together. And we know that there's plenty of district schools that go through periods where you've got to have change in leadership, you've got to have improvement, but at least there is, I would say as a trustee, there's accountability on somebody like me, because if if families, if voters come and say, how come that school isn't getting any better? They can throw me out of office. Yeah. But if we've got this sort of, like you're saying, Wild West, environment, I can tell you, and you know this, how many conversations I've had, over many years with parents who come and say, my kid is in a charter school, and here are all the things that we've got a problem with, and so fix it. And I got to say, you got to go talk to the board of the charter school,
right,
which often, by the way, is not elected,
right,
and the parent has very little recourse there. So I think, again, if we understand that charter schools are part of the public school system in a community like San Diego, and if we value the track record that so many of our charter schools have built over so many years, in the way that we would value the same track record of district schools, I think we have to respect that level of expertise, that sense of community that's been built within a charter school environment over many years, the level of professionalism of the educators and the leaders at that charter school. These aren't, Wild West startups. No. And so let's create an environment that supports all of our schools. And again, the idea of, these sort of market concepts, competition, winners and losers. Well, how many losers do we really want in a public school system? It's not the same thing. We're not in a public system. We're accountable ultimately for all kids succeeding, and all schools should be a quality school. And it's not okay to say that some should win and some should lose. And so we've got to, be able to think about, our schools and protecting the stability of our schools and investing in those schools, as that's the framework that we should be using to think about whether our school system is succeeding or failing, not the framework that's sort of incorporated from, market competition theories.
Like the MySpace versus Facebook, right? There aren't a lot of lives lost because MySpace didn't take off, or Betamax
absolutely.
versus VHS, right?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
How do you, so you mentioned the charter school board composition, and, full disclosure, Einstein's board is a self-perpetuating board with a modicum of community input,
yes,
and stakeholder committee that helps recommend membership, but ultimately the board has a thumbs up or thumbs down on the membership.
Yes.
How does an elected school board continue on a trajectory that puts children first? Because simply given the fact that board members are democratically elected does not always ensure that it's going in either in the right direction or any direction.
Or any direction.
So you described a trajectory in San Diego that's been decidedly in a trajectory that you support and you can define.
Yeah.
One of the pros, or at least charter advocates will say, including people like Reed Hastings, talking about the corporate side, that self-perpetuating board, if you have the right vision, you can keep it. Yeah. How does that work with an elected school board and you got 5 trustees and they cycle through?
No, I can tell you the board that we have today is very different from the board I came into, in 2008. And by the way, that board in 2008, it was 5 Democrats. But we had 3-2 split decisions on almost every major issue.
I remember that.
You remember. It took years. Every meeting took years out of all of our lives. That's right. And now, we've got 5 different individuals, that come with different life experiences, different, priorities, but we share a common set of values. And one of those common set of values is that if our kids are going to succeed, we have to govern effectively. So that means that we have to spend a lot of time, going through and clarifying what's the relationship between the board and the superintendent. How do we make decisions in a way that's not just about, somebody's personal pet peeve or desire to grandstand or political ambition or whatever it is. How do we think about effectively, governing the district? And I think, but that doesn't, there's no, you can't ever guarantee that a board is going to work in that way. It is a democratic system. The voters get to choose who they want, to represent the board. And we're 5 board districts that are very different from each other. And so there's never a guarantee that, that the board is going to act in a way that prioritizes, effective governance and thinks about the needs of all kids. We have that now. I think part of that is when somebody decides to run for school board, the process, that, certainly I go through in terms of, deciding who I, choose to support, that parent groups, educators go through. I think there's a pretty strong set of shared values in our community. And among those shared values is equity. And so even if you are a board member that represents, La Jolla or Scripps Ranch, I think there's a shared sense in San Diego that you have to think about the interests of kids south of the 8, south of 94. It's not okay to have a sort of a parochial system where you say, if kids in Scripps Ranch are doing well and kids, at Hoover are not doing well, we don't care about Hoover because, we live up here. So I think it's that sort of, set of shared values in the community that is ultimately what creates a board that can function coherently. And I think we've benefited, from that. But, there's no guarantees. And, I would not want to see, the board at San Diego Unified go back, to a place that it was, a couple of decades ago with constant bickering and superintendents coming and going, because they couldn't deal with the board.
They had to have non-meddling clauses in their contracts.
Yeah, no, and
that's a prenup right there.
That's exactly right. So one of the things that I feel good about in the time that I've been on the board is I think we had when I came onto the board in 2008. I think there had been something like, 6 or 7 superintendent changes over 5 years. And in the time that I've been on the board, we've had really 3 permanent superintendents. Bill Koba lasted 4 years. Yep. Cindy Martin lasted 8 years, which is about 3 times the average tenure of a large urban superintendent. And I think we're going to see Lamont Jackson be in this position for a long time. And that itself produces the kind of stability that's necessary to actually see improvement over time. Because as we know, one of the biggest problems in large urban districts is this sort of pattern of somebody comes in, changes everything, disrupts the system, and then in 2 or 3 years is gone, and then the next person comes in. And so what you always have is disruption. You really don't have, an opportunity for sustained improvement. And I think we've been able to stabilize our district.
Yeah, I was, you watch these, it pops up on my news feed. You see these cases where superintendents are hanging on to their job because of an alleged Brown Act violation that happened while they were on vacation, and some vote happened and they came back from vacation and they didn't have a job. And then their lawyer said, no, you still have one. And I'm thinking, why do you want it?
Why would you want that job?
Yeah. Or you get approved for the job with a 3-2 vote. That's right. That's a steep hill.
That's right.
That's steep from the beginning.
Yeah.
I just have a couple more questions, and I really appreciate your time and going in depth on these. If you could wave a magic wand and create the best school, let's just think of a neighborhood.
Yeah.
The best school in the universe for that neighborhood, what are some of the elements that it would include?
Yeah, and the great thing is, I think if we go around to so many of our neighborhood schools, in our community, and again, district-run schools, charter schools, I think you're going to see the elements, in place. And so what are the key elements? Well, I think number one, the school is a place that a family that lives in the neighborhood feels, yeah, I feel great having my kids go to that school. It may be that, my kid wants to specialize in something like arts and music, and so we're going to go to an SCPA or going to, science and tech, and there's always, again, that's great. And there's always room, in a public school system for those kinds of choices. But I should, as a parent, feel that my neighborhood school is a quality choice. And, and I'm confident that my kid is going to thrive, going to that neighborhood school. That's, I think, critically important. And then what does thrive mean? I think thrive, we should, as people who are responsible for the school system, we should have the same expectations for our schools in terms of how kids are thriving that we do as parents for our own kids. My kids should be energized, should want to go to school in the morning, should have things that they're working on that they love to work on, and adults at that school who recognize them for who they are and what they can contribute and believe in them. And the curriculum should be, broad and expansive and open up worlds, to young people. It's, I had the opportunity to visit South Africa a couple of weeks ago with Sharon Whitehurst Payne and Mike McQuarrie, who just retired from our board. And one of the things, of course, that immediately strikes you, and this is preaching to the choir here with Einstein, the kids all speak more than one language. Yeah. Some cases, they speak multiple languages. That should be, core in our public education system. All kids, and definitely by the time kids are in high school, but, before high school, they should be exposed to and engaged in the real world. So there should be opportunities for real world learning, for our kids. And we know the difference that makes. If you're a kid who you're sitting, it's the old, what we grew up with, where you'd always have the kid in the back of the class and, algebra say, what does it have to do with my life? Well, but if now you're working as an intern in an engineering firm or an architecture firm, you're seeing the difference, that algebra makes in your life. And you're motivated, by a concept of what you can become, as your education progresses. So I think schools that connect to our kids, connect to our families, offer a broad range of opportunities in the curriculum, and are motivating our kids to want to be there and to want to be learners, that's a great school. And it could look different, but I think those core elements, are important if we think about what makes a great school.
Yeah, those are the visions that we have for the perfect charter school as well.
Right.
So the charter, traditional, public, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I think this element of kindness,
yes,
and the professionals at the school, and by that I mean everyone who works there, not just people with credentials, really wanting to be there.
Yes.
That teaching's not, and education's not a career of default.
That's right.
Or fallback or last resort.
That's right.
Or stability in an uncertain economic time. We know people have to make a living, but again, we're not talking about widgets, and we're not talking about, is this app going to fail or not? These are trajectory changers for multiple generations.
The first time I met Cindy Martin, when she was the principal at Central, and this, by the way, was not unique to Cindy, but it was definitely, part of the story of what was happening there at Central. And by the way, Central, Central is 100% of the students free
City
and reduced
Heights,
alerts.
yeah,
City
yeah.
Heights, large immigrant community, all of those things. And what you would immediately observe were parents were engaged. They were coming to Family Fridays. They were in the classroom. Kids had a lot of confidence in themselves. They were proud, to kind of stand up and tell you what they were reading or what they were learning about. All of those things. But one element that was pretty telling was at a school like Central, in a typical, sort of large district, after, a teacher has enough, tenure to be able to post and bid, to go up to La Jolla, and it's not that teachers don't work hard in La Jolla, but a teacher in La Jolla, when the school day ends, can kind of go home. A teacher in City Heights, the second half of their day, begins, because now they're doing all the things, to engage with families. In 6 years, there had not been one teacher at Central that had voluntarily bid on, a position, at another school. And by the way, that was true. I think of our deputy superintendent, Fabiola Bagula, who was the principal at Balboa Elementary, and our similar characteristics. None of the teachers left. And what you're describing, David, is exactly, again, what if I'm a parent and I want to know, should I send my kid to this school? One of the things I'm going to want to know is, do the teachers want to be here? And is this an environment, where they're choosing to come every day because they feel like they can be effective? That's going to contribute to a great school.
Yeah, I think, a big school district, a small charter, we all face the same pressures,
yes.
right? You advertise for a position, depending on what the job market's like.
Yep.
You might get someone, if it's a tight market, someone's applying at 10 different places.
Yes.
And so they get interviews here and there, and they may or may not drill down deep enough to even understand who they potentially are joining as a school community.
That's right.
And so it's really incumbent upon the leadership of that community to embrace that person and bring them into the vision.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's really hard to have a sustained direction in that everyone shares,
yes.
and a vision that everyone shares. I think
yes.
We at Einstein, and I think we're not unique in the charter world, we have folks who join us who really seek out charters. This is what I want to do.
Yeah.
And we have people who come here because we were the first people to call them for an interview.
Right. Yes.
Or people who don't know anything about charter schools,
yes.
and then they come in the door, and then a lot of our orientation, and I meet with all new staff, just to get to know them as people, but to also ask them if they know what a charter is.
That's right.
And what a charter's not.
Yes.
So I think this is a challenge that'll never end, right?
Yes.
It's the beauty of this profession, but also one of the frustrations too, right?
One of the big challenges,
yeah,
sure.
One of the big challenges.
Yeah.
Who are your mentors? Where do you get your inspiration, and where does your endurance come from? Because it's been a long journey now, and so you're certainly not in it to get rich. So
that is true.
So where do you find inspiration?
Well, look, the people that I think about, to the degree that, I make sacrifice or, I endure things, it's not even a comparison. So, my dad came to this country when he was 28 years old. He had grown up in a small town in Colombia. Was actually one of the first people in his town to leave and go to the big city, Cartagena, and go to university. Huge transition for him. Became a lawyer, became actually a municipal judge in Colombia by the time he was in his late 20s, and fell in love with my mom, and it's a crazy story how that happened, but came to the United States, didn't speak a word of English. And couldn't practice law.
Did she speak Spanish?
She spoke Spanish,
okay.
yeah. So she was a Spanish major in college,
okay.
and I'll tell you that story sometime. But so you think about as so many, immigrant parents that we have in our district, my dad had to start over from scratch. Country that he didn't know, language that he didn't know, was, working 4 jobs at once, pumping gas, went back to school, got a PhD in Spanish literature, and became a professor at San Diego State. There's nothing in my life that will ever match the sacrifice that he had to make, the challenge that he had to make, for his own kids. And my mom as well. My mom grew up in a poor family. She was a Depression-era kid, in New York, first in her, family to go to college. So I just think what my parents were able to do, is something that, is obviously within me every day. And then I think about, the people that I've just had the honor to, work for and learn from. Again, I mentioned Ken M. Samaji and Fahadi Jeffers, who had formed the United Domestic Workers. Carlos and Linda Legretti, who worked with the United Farm Workers and now run the Cesar Chavez Service Clubs for Kids. People who put their entire lives into something that they believed in and had to every day figure out how they were going to, buy groceries that night or, afford the bills. And if you talk to, Ken, or unfortunately Fahadi passed away a few years ago, but if you talk to Carlos and Linda, they don't see that what they did was a sacrifice. They see that they are privileged to have had the opportunity to put their life into something that they believe in.
A life of service.
A life of service. That's right. Yeah. So that's pretty motivating. And then, like you, David, being in public education, one of the privileges that we have is we get to see people every day, who are so invested in our kids and are willing to do anything, that our kids need. You and I, had been talking previously about if there seems to be a struggle happening with the student, we have educators that will go and visit their home and get to know their parents and figure out, what's going on and how they can support them. I mean, so, the inspiration, comes just from the fact that we're privileged to work in an institution that is the most important institution in a democracy, because it means that no matter where you come from, what your background is when you enter into our public schools, if our public schools are working the way that they're supposed to, you can become anything you want and contribute back to the world, in a pretty significant way. And we have the privilege, of being able to be a part of that system.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it brings into even tighter focus the kind of the counter narrative. If you think about some states where governors are intentionally going in and what I would argue are squashing the institution for political motives. Yeah. So I'm glad we're in California, and I'm thankful that my journey has led. And this isn't just me pandering, that my journey has led to be in the charter world and be able to work with folks from San Diego Unified and seeing, we're all human, so we're never going to be perfect. Yeah. But as the MLK quote about the long arc of history bends towards justice.
That's right. That's right. We a public school system is something that every generation has to fight for. And a public school system in the exact same way that it creates opportunity and opens up opportunity, it also challenges the status quo. If the public schools are being done right, that means every generation, of people who come through that public school system have an opportunity to change the status quo. And some people don't like that, and some people are going to fight against it. And then there are the, hucksters who always think it's good politics to scapegoat people and divide people. And, so if you have a public school system that's trying to support all of our kids, including immigrant kids, including LGBTQ kids, including transgender kids, all of those, things that, our kids are challenged with. And if a public school system, we're wrapping our arms around all of our kids and creating opportunities, well, the easiest thing for a two-bit politician is to get people riled up and say, this kid's not like your kid, and so, let's rail against them. And unfortunately, that's part of what politics are in this country. I don't think it's what most Americans actually support. It's certainly not what most people in California or San Diego support. But we got to fight for it every day because there's always, the opportunist out there who's going to try to tear down public schools. We've seen that, throughout our history. And it's something we've got to fight for.
I'm going to wrap up on this one.
Yeah.
So public education, obviously, and we haven't really talked about the pandemic. Actually, refreshingly, we haven't talked about the pandemic.
Wow.
I thought you were going to bring out the pandemic as the number one challenge. That's been, but during the pandemic, it was interesting because for the first time, so parents were able to very often look into, virtually look into their kids' classrooms.
That's right.
See what was being taught.
Yeah.
I would argue that some traditionally disenfranchised parents were suddenly enfranchised.
Yes.
It also created these culture wars around to mask or to not.
Yeah.
It created strange cultural bedfellows between far right, who were not in favor of vaccines, and the left, members of the left who also were not in favor of vaccines for other other reasons, right? And I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but when you look at what has happened with school boards around the country in certain states where you probably couldn't pay me enough ever to want to run for school board in Texas, for example, in some places. Public education has been battered and buffeted rather in the past 2 to 3 years. It will recover. It's been more than a century, and it's going to recover. But if you could design a billboard, think about people driving by and they only have a few seconds to look at this billboard, and this would be Richard Barrera's message to the world about the promise of public education, what would it say?
Wow. And I'm probably a terrible marketing person. I think the picture on the billboard, would reflect, what we described earlier, a classroom of thriving kids who, reflect the diversity in our community, and with a connected, caring adult. So you'd have that kind of picture in a billboard. And I think the message would be, they're going to pull us out of this. In other words, our kids are the ones who are going to solve these problems. The best that we can do, again, as a society, is to equip our kids with the confidence and, ability to keep learning. And if we do that, I am very confident that our kids are going to move us past some of the things that, we just, as adults, can't seem to get beyond. Racism, bigotry, greed, a lack of appreciation, for our planet. Kids will move us past that. You get to work with kids every day that are so clear about what we're going to need to do in the future, to make this world a better place. So the slogan would be something about, if we do right by them now, they're going to save the world in the future. And we know that that's true.
Thank you, Richard. That's a perfect place to wrap for today. Hopefully in the future we can at some point revisit for 2.0.
That sounds good.
It's been a real pleasure and honor to have you joining us on the Superintendent's Hangout.
Appreciate it, David.
Thank you for joining us for the Superintendent's Hangout. Check out the show notes for any links that we discussed in today's episode. You can also follow on Twitter at DVS1970. Thanks again for hanging out.